Why do guitars have frets? And why do they get closer together as you go higher up? There's more to it than you might think. For those who don't know, a fret is one of these raised pieces of metal on a guitar neck. Each one corresponds to a musical note. You probably know that playing notes at higher frets, like this, corresponds to higher notes, because the length of string that's vibrating is shorter. But if you look a little closer, you'll see there's something else going on.
When you play a note on the guitar, you actually place your finger just behind the fret, so that the string makes contact with the fret, like this. This means that the exact position of your finger doesn't matter so much, as long as you cause the string to come in contact with the fret. This is because the length of string that vibrates is from the fret to the bridge, not from your finger.
So why is this important? Well, first of all, it makes playing chords a lot easier. If the exact position of your fingers affected the pitch of the note you get, all chords would sound terrible. That's because it would be pretty difficult to align your fingers perfectly every time. This is something that other stringed instruments like violins and cellos don't have to worry about, since they don't play chords. But that's not the only reason why guitars have frets.
Looking at the frets themselves, you'll see that they're made out of metal. This is important for something called sustain. Sustain is basically how long a note lasts. It's pretty relevant to musicians because if your notes don't last long enough, you can't do stuff like this. Now, if you play an open string, that is, play a string without fretting any notes, you get a certain amount of sustain. And it's pretty useful to get the same amount of sustain when you do put your finger down. The metal frets are great for allowing the notes to ring out because, as we said, the string vibrates from the fret to the bridge, not from your finger.
Again, this is something that violins and other stringed instruments don't have to worry about, because they're simply played differently. You can use a bow to create longer notes, rather than relying on the instrument itself to keep the note going. So, why do the frets keep getting closer as you get higher up?
To understand this, we need to look at how the frequencies of sound relate to music. There are 12 different notes from A to G sharp, which can all be played at different octaves. For example, here's an E note being played at 4 different octaves. All of those were E's, and if you play them all at the same time on a piano, it would sound like this. That's one note being played at 4 different octaves. They all kind of blend into one, right? Much more than these two do. Now, they all have the same musical properties, even though they're clearly at different frequencies. We know that different frequencies of waves give rise to different notes, and these notes have different pitches. Basically, the higher the note, the higher the pitch. At this point, we'll restrict ourselves to only considering the fundamental frequency of a note. Now, if you watched our other video on why different instruments have different sounds, you'll know that there are other frequencies, called overtones. Those are associated with a note on that particular instrument, but we won't go into that this video.
For example, here's an A with a frequency of about 440 Hz. That is 440 oscillations of the wave per second. And here's the E above it, with a frequency of 659 Hz. It turns out that if you go to the A above that first A, that note has a frequency that is double the frequency of the first A. This is what makes these notes an octave apart. Their frequencies have a 1:2 ratio.
Ratios like this between different frequencies of different notes are the reason why some notes sound good together and others don't. It can also help explain the different emotions that music can elicit, like why some chords sound happy and others sound sad. So, how is this relevant to why guitars have frets? Well, as we discussed earlier, there are 12 notes in music, and each note corresponds to a different fret. Going from one note to the next is called going up by a semitone. Going up by 12 frets gets us to the note 12 semitones higher. This is an octave. For example, here's a C on a guitar, and if you go 12 frets higher, this is the C above it.
We know that these notes must have frequencies that differ by a factor of 2, so the wavelength of the higher note will be half that of the lower note, since frequency and wavelength are inversely proportional. This means that the length of the string that's vibrating must be half as long. Now, we can extend this to all other notes, since they're all equally spaced in terms of frequency. So if this ratio is 2, then this ratio must be the 12th root of 2. That way, if you go up 12 times, you end up at that ratio of 2.
So when you go from this fret to this fret, the length of vibrating string gets shorter by a factor of 1 over the 12th root of 2, or 2 to the power minus 1 over 12. So the distances between the frets and the bridge get smaller each time by this factor, which is about 0.944. So the distance between these two frets is slightly smaller than the distance between these two frets. which is why they keep getting closer together as you go higher up. Now let's put some of this stuff into action. Thanks for watching.